There's not, as far as I know, a comparable contemporary family to the Wilsons, either in Southern agriculture or otherwise. The Wilson Company usually dates themselves to 1886, but I would take that back to Josiah Wilson, who laid the foundation for what Lee Wilson built on. That's 1846 to 2010. That's a long run, and I don't think there's anything else like that. To some extent it was timing, but it was also vision. It was Josiah who took the remarkable and dangerous and maybe foolhardy step of crossing the Mississippi River and coming into this swamp and mosquito-infested area and laid the foundations for it. He had this vision of cutting timber and then doing something with the land underneath the timber. Now, that wasn't always the case. In fact, often they viewed the cut-over land as worthless. He saw something different. He was in a very dangerous environment, but it was an environment that also provided him great opportunity, and that's what he saw. The 1850s were the boon in cotton production. It was always curious to me that despite his son's later great success as this great planter, Josiah Wilson did not make an appearance in any of the sort of plantation lore written about Mississippi County. And I've always found that curious, and I think it's probably because he never built that grand house. So he didn't fulfill the image of the popular image in the 1930s, the period in which Gone with the Wind was written, the image of Tara. Josiah didn't fulfill that, so he didn't earn a place in that record. It's also true that Lee Wilson never dwelt on that. He never dwelt on his origins. He never talked about, as far as I've been able to determine, or anyone else has been able to determine, talked about his mother and father. He was all about now, what he's doing right now. Well, he, of course, was the son of a frontier planter who was a wealthy man by the standards of the day, but born in 1865, weeks before Appomattox, before the end of slavery. Josiah, he moves to Memphis, Tennessee, and he promptly dies in 1870. Lee Wilson is 5 years old in 1870. His father made the mistake of not drafting a will before he died. His mother dies in the yellow fever epidemic of 1878. He's an orphan now. He's 13 years old. He becomes a charge of his uncles, his father's brother in Covington. He's unhappy there. We don't know much about it, but he leaves there in 1880. He's 15 years old in 1880, and he crosses the Mississippi River and settles on some swamp-ridden property near Golden Lake in Mississippi County. By the time Lee came on and took control of his property in 1882, it was still heavily forested and a lot of swamp, but the ground had been broken. He had a model. He was a supreme practitioner of that model. But at this point in time, in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, early 20th century, the older South was experiencing decreasing fertility of soil, and whites and blacks both were moving to the western edge of the South, and so they were coming into Arkansas in particular. And the timber industry brought many of them, and he was there. So he adopted the tenancy and sharecropping system, which was the system that arose to replace the slave labor system. And it was better, obviously, than slave labor, but it was, some historians have called it another kind of slavery, where you become so indebted to the planter for whom you work that by law you are not able to leave his employment. So if someone left a planter's employment, the deputy sheriff would go after them and bring them back. Already by the 1920s, the sort of myth of the agricultural ladder, working your way out of sharecropping and tenancy to land ownership, was showing itself to be just that, a myth. So you're making a sort of hard decision to settle for a certain kind of life that had limits. By 1923, when this magazine writer was describing Lee Wilson as like a feudal baron of old, the town of Wilson would have looked like that to him. It would have looked like an intact town that was under one man's control, and largely it was. He owned every building in it. In fact, he owned every house in town. There was nobody owned a house except Lee Wilson owned it. He had a bank. He had a drugstore. He had, by that time, a little service station. Automobiles were just then becoming popular. He had, well, just about everything you could imagine. If you needed to spend your money, you could spend it here, and that's what he preferred. He paid you in what they called scrip, sort of like little coupons, and the only place that coupon was redeemable was in one of the Wilson enterprises. So he paid you out of one pocket and took it back into the other pocket. So that was a pretty useful business model for him. But in 1923, it was an interesting time for that to be written, because the 1920s were a particularly difficult period in agriculture. Lee Wilson was leveraging money like crazy. In 1923, the very year this story was written, he borrowed $500,000 from some financiers in St. Louis, and he pledged every brick and stick of building in the town of Wilson as collateral for that. Now, realistically, that town wasn't worth $500,000. So these financiers were betting on Lee Wilson, because they knew Lee Wilson to be a force to be reckoned with. And by all descriptions, that's the kind of man he was. When he walked into a room, he controlled the room. He was as comfortable in the boardroom as he was in the sawmill or out in the sticks. He was that kind of personality. He was ruthless at times. He was opportunistic. He took tremendous risks that more prudent men probably wouldn't have taken. He made sure that there were good educational opportunities. He built a state-of-the-art white school, and he built a state-of-the-art black school in 1924, 1925. And in the dead of night, early morning hours of the day it was to be dedicated, the school burned to the ground. He said, I wanted to build them a school, and thanks to all they have done for me, speaking of the African American population, and I am going to rebuild it, only this time I will build it of brick. So the town of Wilson was pretty much his town. He thought of himself as in control, and he certainly demonstrated a great desire to be in control. His correspondence, his directions to his farm managers are minute. It must have been exhausting to exercise the kind of oversight that he exercised, but in control, that's another matter, and there were clear incidences of violence more than once. I think that the reasons that the Wilson plantation is historically significant is it provides the opportunity to look at a couple of things that I think are all important about understanding post-Civil War agriculture in the South. One is the exploitive labor system that they employ, and the growing sophistication of plantation agriculture that takes us to the 21st century in the portfolio plantation. So you see the full transition from slave plantation and Lee Wilson's father's incarnation through the portfolio plantation today. So you have an opportunity to explore what that means in terms of the social and economic and environmental implications over a very long period of time. I think also is just as many Southern historians and other people are captivated by trying to understand slavery, we're captivated by trying to understand this peculiar place called the South. This tortured history it has. It confounds us and confuses us and consternates us and begs our consideration.